guys, it's Savannah from China Admissions. Today I'm going to be introducing to you the difference between simplified and traditional Chinese characters, talking about the history and the modern day usage of both, and help you decide which one you should learn on your Chinese language journey. Alright, let's get started. So to understand the difference between simplified and Chinese characters, we need to go back a little bit and look at the history of their development. Chinese is a language with a really long linguistic history, thousands of years of written characters, starting from pictograms written on shells, bones, and other natural objects, and evolving into a standardized script. This script was formalized in about the 5th century AD, and it was the only character script mainly in use up until the 20th century. These characters are known as traditional characters, 繁体字 or 正体字 in Chinese. So if you learned Chinese at any time before the 20th century, you would be learning 繁体字, traditional Chinese characters that look like this. Kind of complicated and different than what we're used to seeing. This is because after 1949, when the People's Republic of China was founded, China realized it had a huge problem, which was illiteracy. According to the Ministry of Education statistics, in 1950, only 20% of Chinese people could read and write traditional characters. This was obviously a huge problem for China, so China immediately started a literacy campaign, which involved simplifying certain traditional characters into a new form and standardizing them and teaching them to people so that people could learn a more simplified version to increase their literacy at a faster rate. This is where Simplified Chinese comes from. So as you can see, it's a relatively recent form of writing the Chinese language. This literacy campaign worked with stellar success. Today, over 85% of Chinese people are literate, which is thanks in a large part to Simplified Chinese, easier to write, easier to remember, and therefore easier to learn. So right away, based on this history, we can answer one crucial question about Simplified and traditional Chinese. They're not different languages. Simplified and traditional Chinese characters are just different writing scripts for the exact same language, which is Mandarin Chinese. So no matter if you learn traditional or if you learn simplified, when you speak and talk to people, you'll all be communicating in Mandarin Chinese.
我在草丛中，我躺在草地上，我躺在阳光下的草地上。
There's another huge misconception, which is that traditional and simplified Chinese characters are all completely different. This isn't true. In the 1950s, when China was working on its simplified character campaign, they only simplified a few thousand characters, so there are quite a lot of characters that were never changed at all. This means even if you learned simplified Chinese your entire life, you could pick up a book in traditional Chinese and still be able to identify some characters and figure out the basics of what's going on. There's another popular misconception, which is that simplified Chinese is easy and traditional characters are hard. Sorry to break it to you, but this is not true. No matter if you learn traditional character with 15 strokes or a simplified character with 5 strokes, you're still going to have to spend quite a bit of time working on memorizing these characters. Chinese is a hard language, and simplified can help, but it can't take away all the work that you're going to have to put into learning the language. Alright, let's start with simplified Chinese. Why should you learn simplified Chinese if it's such a recent language and it wasn't even used in China before the 1950s? A few simple reasons. Simplified Chinese is used primarily in the Chinese mainland, Singapore, and Malaysia. If you plan to study or live in any of these 3 locations, you should learn Simplified Chinese. Of course, the Chinese mainland is a top study destination for students, and everyone is interested in learning about Chinese language and culture. So learning Simplified Chinese can help you access all of the resources, textbooks, and Chinese courses for foreigners that are coming out of the Chinese mainland right now. Because there are just a lot of people living in the Chinese mainland, as well as in Singapore and Malaysia, the percentage of new Chinese publications that are written in Simplified Chinese is super high. Over 98% of new media and books and online magazines are all written in Simplified Chinese. So this will give you a huge advantage. If you want to read the most modern Chinese content possible from like news websites to TV shows, you should learn Simplified Chinese. This will give you a pretty big advantage in consuming modern Chinese content. In addition, if you want to take the HSK, which is the Mandarin Chinese proficiency exam offered by China to foreign learners, then you'll need to learn Simplified. The HSK is all in Simplified Chinese. So learning Simplified will give you a huge advantage when taking this test. If you're a student and you want to get your Chinese to a level of conversational proficiency about HSK 3 or 4, this will help you communicate with taxi drivers, waiters, your classmates, and your teachers without major problems. Then Simplified Chinese is going to be enough for you. Remember, Simplified Chinese and Traditional Chinese are just different ways of writing the same language. So for conversational purposes, like for your study or your internships, you can learn Simplified Chinese and focus on your speaking and listening skills, and then be able to communicate quite easily, even with people who live in places that use traditional Chinese characters. All right, so those are just a few reasons why you should learn Simplified Chinese. Also, because Simplified Chinese was literally designed to make it easier to learn for people who didn't know any Chinese to start with, foreigners often find Simplified Chinese characters much easier to study, learn, and remember. So if you're worried about your ability to study Chinese or how hard it will be to start a really complicated language, start with Simplified. It takes some of the stress of really complicated characters away. You can learn a few more basic ones, and that will help give you a good foundation in Chinese language. So those are just a few of the reasons why you should learn Simplified Chinese. Now let's look at traditional. Why should you learn traditional Chinese at all if Simplified Chinese is used much more often and is easier for foreigners to learn? There are a few reasons, and a lot of them have to do with geography. Traditional Chinese characters are used in Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, the Philippines, and in Chinese American communities in the US. So if you plan to live or study in any of those places, then you should definitely learn traditional Chinese characters. They'll help you a lot, much more than Simplified ever would, because street signs and advertisements and TV subtitles in Taiwan and Hong Kong are all going to be in traditional. In addition, a lot of people have really strong opinions about the historical and cultural beauty of traditional Chinese characters. Just as an example of this, let's take a look at the character I, which means love. So here it is in the traditional and simplified version. In the traditional version, you can see that the character for heart, Xin, is right in the middle of the character for love. This is considered really beautiful by a lot of people. The heart is literally inside the word for love. And in the simplified version, the heart is gone. They took the heart out as part of the simplification process. What's left is actually the character for friend, you, which is in the bottom half of the character for love, I. So this may be a philosophical question: which is more important in the definition of love, friendship or the heart? But anyways, whatever your opinion on that question, you might have a lot of strong opinions about the historical beauty and cultural richness of traditional Chinese characters. If you feel really strongly about this, definitely try learning traditional to get a better sense of Chinese cultural and linguistic history through the characters. Alright, in addition, because Simplified Chinese is a super modern language, it wasn't put into use until the 20th century, everything written before about the year 1950 is going to be in traditional Chinese characters. This means if you're interested in studying Chinese linguistics, art, history, anything that would have occurred before the year 1950, you're going to need to learn traditional Chinese characters. You'll need this in order to read calligraphy, read ancient documents, read reports and books and poetry that was written in ancient China. If you want to access any of these pre-20th century Chinese historical resources, you're definitely going to need to know some traditional Chinese in order to get through them. So those are just a few reasons why you should learn traditional Chinese. Now, which one should you learn? You can see that the biggest differences between simplified and Chinese character scripts are in the area of study that you want to focus on, and also in the locations of the world where they're spoken. If you want to study Chinese history or anything involving ancient Chinese life or culture, you're definitely going to need to focus more on traditional characters than you would if you just went to study modern Chinese business. In that case, Simplified Chinese is going to be fine to help you on your way. I myself started off learning traditional characters, then I switched to Simplified when I went to school in mainland China. And then I realized a little bit too late that I should have kept up with my traditional, because I actually studied China Studies in both my undergrad and my graduate degree. And as part of that degree, I was looking up some ancient Chinese sources, things written in the early 20th century and in the 19th century. And I realized that I had forgotten most of the traditional characters that I once knew. So in my case, it was beneficial for me to learn both Simplified and traditional Chinese. Your scenario might be different, so you should think carefully about where you'll study and what subject before you come to a decision. However, most experts of Chinese language believe that you'll always need to know both. This is the hard truth. If you want to be fully fluent in Chinese, have a good understanding of its linguistic development, be able to communicate with people both in Singapore and in the Philippines and in Hong Kong and in Beijing, you're going to need to get familiar with both Simplified and traditional Chinese in order to fully access the entire world of Chinese language material that's out there. This is not as hard as you might think. Remember that only a few thousand characters were simplified from traditional, so there are a lot of characters that are still the same. Even if you only learn Simplified Chinese your entire life, when you start learning traditional, you're not going to be starting from level 0. Also, the characters weren't just simplified randomly according to someone's opinion or personal whim. They were simplified according to a set of standard rules. So you can get familiar with the rules that China used to simplify characters, and knowing these rules will help you be able to identify the characters both in their traditional and in their simplified form. Chinese is a pretty difficult language. We all understand that, but having the option to choose between simplified and traditional Chinese gives you some freedom in how you want to approach the language and what you want to use it for. If you want to find a Chinese class that fits you and your study needs and your personal goals, check the link in the description box. We have a ton of classes from a ton of different universities and organizations that can help you get to the level you want to be. I hope this helped explain things better and helped you come to a decision about whether you should learn Simplified or traditional Chinese. See you guys next time.